All right, I believe it is now 10 o'clock, maybe just a little bit after, so we can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on what is, looking out the window, it's a mostly sunny morning across most of eastern North Carolina. We had a cold front come through last night, so we woke up to a much chillier air mass this morning, but drier as well. So we should be mostly dry through the next next day or two. Is what it's looking like. So thank you very much for joining us. This is, of course, Hurricane Preparedness Week. There is a reason that they have this week in early May, even though it's hard to think that hurricane season's just around the corner already. And we'll get to why that reason is here a little bit later in the presentation. So again, I'm Carl Barnes, a meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Newport, Morehead City, North Carolina. And we'll go ahead and jump into the presentation and see what all we can learn about hurricanes this morning. So firstly, the use of GoToWebinar, which is the software that we're using for this presentation this morning. We do have a couple buttons in the control panel or the toolbar, if you want to call it that, that you have available. So firstly, you do have the capability to ask a question at any point during the webinar. If a question pops into your head, please feel free to type it in there. And then at the end, we'll go back and go through some of the questions and do a bit of a Q&A session and make sure that we're answering everything that you have. And then we do also have a button to raise your hand. So that's maybe if I ask a question, say just by show of hands who maybe feels this way or something like that. So we can go ahead and test that feature out. And what we'll do first is just raise your hand if you can hear me this morning. All right, I see a bunch of hands going up, so that is great. Thank you so much for participating. And also, as long as we're talking about participation, we're also going to have a couple of poll questions through the webinar. And what that is essentially the question will pop up and then you'll be able to select your answer. So, just something to keep everyone engaged through the webinar. So let's talk about the National Weather Service first. Our mission, really simple, the protection of life and property, mainly when it comes to weather. So we're ahead of storms. We're working to help people do what we're doing now, preparing and understanding the vulnerabilities and preparing if a storm does come. And then when that storm does start to look like it could affect us, obviously we're issuing forecasts. And then when the storm's getting close, we're issuing warnings. So we're doing this for our office in Eastern North Carolina, but you can see that there are Weather Service forecast offices all across the country. So really focused in the more populated areas, but every square inch of the United States is covered by a National Weather Service weather forecast office. And here in Eastern North Carolina, this is what our area of responsibility looks like for the National Weather Service Morehead City office. Basically cover most of the Outer Banks all the way up to Duck, and then cover down through Jacksonville, and we go inland almost all the way to the I-95 corridor. So obviously an area that is very, very vulnerable to hurricanes, a very low-lying area, lots of water. One of the things that makes Eastern North Carolina great is all the water and the beautiful scenery, but unfortunately that's also what makes us vulnerable to hurricanes. And we are open 24/7, 365, never closed. So we're there during the overnights every night. We're there on holidays and weekends. We're always staffed up with at least 2 meteorologists keeping an eye on the weather. You never know when a thunderstorm or something like that could pop up. So we're always keeping an eye on the radar. We're making the forecasts. Those are constantly updated every 3 hours, forecasts from the National Weather Service. And these pictures here are actually from Hurricane Florence, which we all know affected us just 2 years ago. And our office is in Carteret County. We're actually inland a little bit from Morehead City to help protect us from the storm surge. We're in a nice high area where we're not vulnerable to that storm surge, but we are surrounded by low-lying areas. So Hurricane Florence produced 25 to 30 inches across a good part of Carteret County, and we were actually surrounded by flooding. So we were in the office. Everyone was in there for at least 3, some people 4 or 5 days, day and night, sleeping in the office or working when we were awake to make sure that we were keeping an eye on the weather and issuing warnings and forecasts as needed. So every square inch of space that could be slept in was slept in during Hurricane Florence. It was quite the experience. So our website, if you want to get our forecast, like I said, we're constantly updating it. That would be weather.gov/Morehead City. Very easy to remember because that's the location of our office, but that is going to be the forecast for all of Eastern North Carolina. So you just go to this web page and then we have the map, so you can click on your location on the map. That includes over the waterways. If you're planning on going out fishing or going out on the boat for the day, something like that, you can click the waterway where you're going to be and get the forecast for that area of water. And then additionally, we have this area, this box right here where you can enter your location. And when you enter it there, it'll take you to the forecast for your specific location. So again, that's weather.gov/Morehead City. And that's what we routinely do. But when we have these high impact events, such as a hurricane, a severe weather outbreak, maybe a winter storm, we're also doing these weather briefings to help really pin down the expected impacts of those storms. And those can be found on our webpage, weather.gov/Morehead City. And then you can scroll down and there's this tile where the arrow is pointing. It says weather hazard briefing. And so we're producing those again for the higher impact weather. And this is an example of what that might look like. So we're nailing down specific impacts, like from a hurricane, we'll break it out: wind, surge impact, rainfall impact. Or for the winter storm, we might be able to go into a little more detail about the forecast, some uncertainties or anything like that. We do also have a strong social media presence, Facebook and Twitter, at NWS Morehead City on both sites. And we are also on YouTube. We'll post videos up there sometimes, more informational videos. But be sure that you're giving us a follow on Facebook and Twitter, NWS Morehead City. That's a great way to get information, but not just get it, then share that information to make sure that all of your friends are also getting that information from a reputable source. And as long as we're talking about reputable sources and social media, this is a good time to say that anytime we have a storm coming, you do want to make sure that you're getting your information from a reputable source. So that could be us here at the National Weather Service. Before a hurricane, that could be the National Hurricane Center, which is part of the National Weather Service. It could also be local media. We work really closely with all of our local news stations to make sure that we're all on the same page, we're sharing the same information. We really help them out and they help us out because they're a lot better than we are a lot of times at communicating that information because they have the good platform of being on the news and being on TV. We're also working really closely with local and state officials. So your county emergency managers, any kind of local decision makers from your town, we're giving them direct briefings to help them make decisions such as when to issue an evacuation order, what areas to evacuate, how to prepare for the storm, or what they can expect after the storm for the recovery phase. So local and state officials are another great place to get that information. So next up is going to be actually getting into hurricanes. But before we do that, let's try out this polling feature that I mentioned before. So in a second, you're going to see a poll question pop up on your screen, and then you can just select your answer to that poll. So I just launched the poll. So the question is, what are some reliable sources for weather safety information? And this is what I just went over, where these are the people you're going to want to make sure that you're really focused on getting the information from them ahead of these higher impact events. There's lots of information floating around on social media or on the internet, and some of it's good, some of it's bad, but these are people who you can rely on to always give you high quality information ahead of these storms, to give you safety and preparedness information. So we'll let that poll go for just about another 30 seconds or so to give you plenty of time to answer it. Our possible answers are the National Weather Service or the Hurricane Center, local and state officials, local media, or all of the above. All right, in about 3 more seconds, 2, 1. And we'll see what the results were. So most people said all of the above, which is a great answer. Actually, all of these answers were correct. These are all really good sources to get information from. Again, there is a lot of information that'll flow around social media, so it's hard to be able to tell what's good and what's not. So these are really good sources for information. And when you see information from these, be sure to give it a share so that you can then share the good information with your friends as well ahead of those systems. So, all right, cool. Thank you very much for voting in the poll. We got a couple more of those that we'll get to later. So we'll go ahead and dig into hurricanes now. So I am the hurricane program focal point here at the National Weather Service in Morehead City. The Outer Banks of North Carolina is actually the most frequently impacted area in all of the continental United States for hurricanes. So here in Eastern North Carolina, we are no stranger to hurricanes. We get them on average. We'll see a hurricane come through here about once every 2 to 3 years, but recently it seems like it's been even more than that. But we'll start digging into a little bit about hurricanes. So what are hurricanes called? Well, obviously here they're called hurricanes. That's why it's Hurricane Preparedness Week. That's what we call them in the Atlantic Ocean and the Central and Eastern Pacific Oceans. In the Western Pacific, they call them typhoons, and in the Indian Ocean, they call them cyclones. But my personal favorite is Western Australia, the Southern Indian Ocean. They call them Willy Willies. So I propose that we change the name here, but maybe people wouldn't take it as seriously. I don't know. But anyway, here in the North Atlantic Ocean, the hurricanes that affect us are going to be called hurricanes. So what do hurricanes need to form? There's 6 main ingredients that we're going to talk about. This is really getting into the science, which is my favorite part of it. So for a hurricane to form, we need, firstly, warm ocean water. That's why we have a hurricane season, is because that's the time of year where the water is warm enough to allow the hurricanes to form. In addition to that, they need to be away from the equator. So you might know that any low pressure system in the northern hemisphere rotates one way, and in the southern hemisphere rotates the other direction. Well, in the equator, that's where systems actually don't rotate, because they don't have what's called the Coriolis force. They don't have a very strong Coriolis force acting on them. Coriolis force is the result of the rotation of the Earth. So when you're near the equator, you don't get that rotation that hurricanes need. But as they get a little further away from the equator in the tropics, they can start to rotate like what we're used to seeing from hurricanes. We also need instability. Instability basically means how likely it is that a storm will develop. So in the summertime, when we're looking at thunderstorms, if it's really hot that day, hot air likes to rise. That's known as instability. Well, we can have the same thing in the tropics, where we can have unstable air. It's really stable. It likes to keep those air parcels compressed and doesn't like to let them rise and really strengthen. So we need instability to let those clouds and let the storm have rising air and strengthen. We also need weak wind shear. So wind shear is the difference in wind direction or speed in different heights in the atmosphere. So what we're wanting is a pretty similar wind in the low levels and way up high, maybe 5 or 6 kilometers up in the air, several miles up in the air. And what that does is basically, if you imagine that a storm wants to grow straight up and down, if you have wind blowing in different directions, it's shearing the storm. So it's actually interfering with the ability of the storm to grow tall. We also want plenty of moisture. This is the tropics, so that's not usually an issue, but we do have sometimes air that'll come off of the Sahara Desert in Africa, which we can actually track using satellite imagery. And when that really dry air gets in, it inhibits hurricane formation. But as long as we don't have that air, we usually have plenty of moisture in the tropics where these storms form. And finally, we need some kind of an initial cluster of thunderstorms. We call it a wave. We need something to kick it off and really get the hurricane going. It's got to start from some group of storms typically. So let's take a look what that looks like schematically. So we're looking at rising and sinking air. So where the air is rising, we get clouds and we get rainfall. Where it's sinking, we get clearer air. And that can happen with just a few thunderstorms, but then as that area of thunderstorms continues to grow, we can see what we get on the bottom, where we get strong sinking air in the middle, which is what will eventually become the eye, where we don't usually have rainfall. And then as we go further out from that, we get a series of rising and sinking areas of air. And so that produces what we call rain bands. And as that storm starts to spin, what we were talking about, where it has to be away from the equator so that it can spin, that's where we get the rotation of the hurricane. And then we get the rain bands with rain and then a clear spot and then rain. That's where that air is rising and sinking. So it's a really, really complex system, and there's quite a few things that it takes for a hurricane to get going, which is why some seasons will go several weeks without hurricane formation, because we just don't quite have all the ingredients, kind of like baking a cake. If you don't have all the ingredients, you don't want to do it. If you make that cake without any sugar, or maybe you don't have icing or something like that, it's not quite going to be a good cake. Same thing with hurricanes. If you don't have all the ingredients, it's just not quite going to get going. So once it does have all those ingredients, which usually happens again in the fall during hurricane season, once it has all those ingredients, that's where we can see that hurricane form. So speaking of when hurricanes form, we call this the campfire map. I think you can see why, because of the coloring of it. But what this really is a graphic showing when hurricanes and tropical storms are the most likely to form. So hurricane season technically goes from June 1st through the end of November. So we're coming up on the technical beginning of hurricane season, again, when all those factors that go into hurricane formation are the most favorable. But it peaks usually in mid-September. That's the time when we see the warmest water. We usually see the best moisture in the tropics and the least amount of wind shear, and all those ingredients really come together, usually the best in mid-September, but really anytime from like mid-August through mid to late October is, as you can see from this map, when we have the highest probability of storms forming. But that said, it's not out of the question to get these storms forming in May. So that's why we're having Hurricane Preparedness Week now in beginning of May. Even though across most of the area it was in the 40s this morning, it doesn't feel like hurricane weather, but we're already starting in the tropics to see those ingredients start to come into place. Just back in 2012, we had 2 tropical storms that formed before the technical beginning of hurricane season. So both Beryl and Alberto in 2012 formed in May. So it's May 7th now. So we're already getting toward the time of year where these hurricanes are possible. So that's why we need to go ahead and start thinking about preparedness. So the 2019 hurricane season, just looking back, we had 18 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Of course, the one that had the biggest effect here in eastern North Carolina was Hurricane Dorian, which caused a good amount of storm surge across a lot of eastern North Carolina, but really significant storm surge across a good portion of the Outer Banks, including all the way from Cape Hatteras National Seashore, Ocracoke Island, and a good portion of Hatteras Island, where they saw quite a bit of storm surge inundation and really a lot of damage from that storm. Elsewhere, we got strong winds and we got some heavy rainfall, but Hurricane Dorian was really our biggest impact directly here in eastern North Carolina. But we did have a total of 6 storms last year that impacted the United States. And of course, Dorian and Barry also was a significant impact down south of us. So the outlook for the 2020 hurricane season, the official outlook from NOAA has not been released yet, but based on some of the ingredients that are currently in place, I think we're pretty confident to say that the water's warmer than normal. We're expecting weaker shear than normal and a good amount of moisture in the atmosphere. So we're looking at probably going to see an outlook of above normal hurricane activity expected. But really, that is just an outlook. It's saying for the whole Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. So we really want to focus on us locally. And the fact of the matter is, it only takes one storm. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 was a great example. Made landfall very near Miami and devastated a large area of pretty populated area south of Miami, especially down toward like Homestead, Florida, where they had really, really significant hurricane damage. And that otherwise was a very quiet hurricane season. But if you go down and talk to the people in Miami, there's no way they would say 92 was a quiet hurricane season. So really want to emphasize, it doesn't really matter if it's busy or quiet. All that matters is what happens here in eastern North Carolina, and it only takes one to make it a really busy hurricane season. So what can you do to get ready? Weather.gov/MHX/hurricane prep is a great website that we've created where you can go and get a lot of hurricane preparedness information. The biggest things you want to be thinking about right now is making your plan if a hurricane does come. Do you have somewhere to evacuate to? Do you know your evacuation route? Do you know what area you live in terms of your vulnerability to storm surge or river flooding? Might you have to evacuate, or might you be able to choose to hunker down? Really, ultimately, you're going to want to listen to the advice of local officials because they're going to understand what areas need to evacuate. But understanding your own vulnerability, if you're not told to evacuate, can help you make that decision of whether to stay or whether to go if you have the option. Also, organize your important documents. Make sure you know where all that is, because if you do evacuate, you're probably going to want to take that with you, because if your house does get flooded or damaged, we've seen so many examples of people whose house got flooded and they weren't quite thinking ahead enough, and maybe those really important documents got damaged or maybe even got washed away and they don't know where they are now. So important documents or medications, anything that you really need, you're going to want to make sure that you're prepared either to take that with you or keep it in a safe place. Talk to many people who have been through these storms. We always go out after the storm and talk to people just to see what their experiences were, if they have any advice. One thing that we've heard from several people, a great place to put those important documents if you think flooding is possible, put it in your dishwasher. Obviously, don't turn your dishwasher on, but your dishwasher or your refrigerator, a nice airtight location where if you do get flooding, they're going to be safe in there. That's something that we've heard from several people, especially people who live in flood-prone areas. You're also going to want to make a list of the supplies that you need in your hurricane kit and go ahead and start working on that. Obviously, we're having, some supplies around here are in kind of short supply right now because of everything that's going on with COVID and all the shelter in place and quarantine and all that. So you're going to want to think ahead about that and say, all right, what supplies will I need? Will I be able to get those? Should I go ahead and start working on getting those now while there is still time and not waiting till a hurricane comes? And then everyone's going to be trying to get those same supplies. So you're really going to want to think ahead, make a list, and then start working to secure everything on your list. So what does the National Weather Service do when we have a hurricane that we're watching? Firstly, the National Hurricane Center, which is one part of the National Weather Service located in Miami, Florida. All their information can be found on hurricanes.gov. They're constantly watching the tropics, and they do this thing called a graphical weather outlook that can be found on their webpage, again, hurricanes.gov. And it's keep an eye on the entire Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico for the potential for hurricane formation. It's updated 4 times a day, and it's a really quick and easy way to see if there are any storms either out there currently or that could be forming in the next 5 days. And just to kind of keep yourself updated on the tropics and see what kind of situation we're looking at, especially during the really active parts of the season. Then once they do have a specific storm that they're tracking, they issue both track and intensity forecasts for that storm. One graphic that you've probably seen is this cone of, call it the cone of uncertainty or the forecast cone, whatever you want to call it. But this is a graphic that'll show where the National Hurricane Center thinks that hurricane's going to go. But one thing I really want to stress with this graphic is keep in mind that this is just the forecast track of the center of the storm. This is not the entire area that will receive impacts. For example, this image that we have here is from Hurricane Florence. And you can see that the track of the center of the storm, this is actually pretty close to where it tracked. Went just past just to our south and made landfall very near Wilmington. So this is a pretty good forecast of where it tracked. But we had impacts from Florence well outside of this area of the cone of uncertainty. So this is just the center of the storm, not the entire area to receive impacts. And as long as we're talking about the track of the storm, I just want to make a plug that, again, the National Hurricane Center is a great place to get forecast information from. They do issue the official hurricane track forecast for the National Weather Service. And this is a graphic of how those forecasts have trended. So really in the last couple of decades, the forecasts have gotten significantly better. So the 2019 season, they had a very small increase in the error. So that's how far off they were in their track. But overall, you can see over the last several decades that those errors have really significantly trended downwards. And as an example, here's Florence's approach to the US. So this is all of the forecasts that the National Hurricane Center issued for Hurricane Florence. And you can see that there was very little change from one forecast to the next. The general track of the storm approaching kind of from the southeast, approaching southeastern North Carolina, and then making landfall somewhere in southeast North Carolina, south of Cape Lookout, is pretty consistently what they were calling for the whole time. So that was just one example of the National Hurricane Center forecast is really high quality. And they make that forecast based on their forecaster experience as well as the models. So you've maybe heard the European model is the best, the American model is the best. One does better this time, one does better next time. And that's really the case where it depends on the storm. We don't know beforehand which model is going to do best. So what the forecasters out at the National Hurricane Center are doing, and I know the forecasters down there, they, between all of them, probably have 150 years of hurricane forecasting experience. So these are really the best of the best. They're looking at all these models, applying their experience to make that official forecast. What this graph is showing is for a lot of the storms in 2019, it varied which model did the best. So this GFSI, this is actually the American model. The EGRI is the UK Met. The EMXI, the light blue line, is the European model. So you can see the lower for each storm, the lower the point is on the graph, the more accurate that model, or the better the forecast was from that model. So you can see depending on the storm, I mean, we look at Dorian and you can see that gold line is the lowest. That's actually the UK Met. So the UK Met model outperformed the European model, which is the one a lot of people say are the best. So it really varies from storm to storm. Your best bet is always going to be to put the most weight in that National Hurricane Center forecast. That's the forecast you should be making your plans based off of. So tropical cyclone impacts. We have several potential impacts from a storm. We can do wind, storm surge, wave run up, rainfall, freshwater flooding, tornadoes, and rip currents. And we'll dig into all of those here in just a second. But first, we have another poll question. Get to pop up. We have another poll question that we will put out. So true or false, hurricanes can form outside of hurricane season, which is June through November. So we kind of went over this. You might remember the campfire graph that I showed you. Just going for true or false that hurricanes can form outside of hurricane season, which is June 1st through the end of November. And we'll give just about 15 more seconds to answer this question. All right, and 3, 2, 1. All right, the poll is now closed, and I am so glad people were paying attention. That is absolutely true. As we showed, we've had several storms that have formed in May, especially here in the southeast. A cluster of thunderstorms can form over the really warm Gulf Stream and just have just the right ingredients to actually form just off of our coast. So it's totally possible in May that we get hurricanes to form, and after November is possible as well. But really the peak of hurricane seasons in September. That's when we're most likely to get those stronger storms. But yeah, we need to be preparing now because it's not out of the question to get storms this time of year. So thank you very much for participating. We'll go ahead and hide the results and jump back into some learning. All right, so let's talk about the wind aspect of a hurricane. I'm sure you've all heard of the categorization of hurricanes, category 1, category 2. That's called the Saffir Simpson scale that those hurricanes are categorized off of. And I want to stress that is just the wind aspect of the storm. That's not all of the impacts of the storm. So the wind, and not only just the wind of the storm, that is the one maximum point, the strongest wind anywhere in that storm, the single strongest wind that's expected in that storm over a given area. So it's really not a good indication of the overall strength or impacts of the storm as much as it is just the wind aspect of the storm. So it's all about impacts. Since 2010 in the US, category 1 hurricanes, hear a lot of people say it's just a category 1. It's like nails on a chalkboard to some of us, because some of these category 1 storms have higher impacts than some stronger storms. There's so much more to it, but just since 2010, 175 direct deaths from these category 1 storms and $105 billion worth of damage. So really want to stress that that category of the storm, the wind aspect of the storm, does not tell the whole story. So one thing that is a threat from a hurricane in addition to the wind is storm surge. This is where I want to tell you something that I hope you remember. When it comes to hurricanes, it's the water, not the wind, that's the killer. It's the water, not the wind. From 1963 to 2012, almost 50% of deaths in these hurricanes were from storm surge, and over 80% were from any kind of water aspect, so storm surge, rainfall flooding, rip currents, anything involving water. Florence specifically killed 15 people, and 11 of those were water related. So I really want you to remember it's the water, not the wind. So what do we do for storm surge? Well, ahead of the storm surge, we're making forecasts, and then we issue these storm surge watches 48 hours ahead of when we expect the storm surge to start. So this is going to be issued for the specific area where we're expecting storm surge to be possible. On the top left, we have what a map of that storm surge could look like. And then on the bottom left, we actually have another graphic that you'll find in those weather briefings that I talked about earlier, where it shows the specific inundation values for communities. Unfortunately, this isn't quite good enough to go all the way down and look at your specific house, but it gives you a really good idea of the storm surge threat to your community. So we encourage people to keep an eye on this, but really the storm surge watch and warning is what you should be making your decisions off of if you don't already have evacuation orders in place from public officials. And then 36 hours ahead of the start of storm surge, so a day and a half ahead of time, if we're still expecting storm surge of 3 feet or greater, so life-threatening storm surge, we'll upgrade it to a storm surge warning, again, for the specific areas where we're expecting that storm surge. So Hurricane Florence was the last event where we had, away from the Outer Banks, where we had really significant storm surge. We saw 8 to 11 feet of storm surge inundation. So you can imagine, I mean, I'm 6 foot tall, and if I was standing right on the edge of the water, that's still another 2 to 5 feet above how tall I am. So, I mean, that's really significant. Obviously, that's life-threatening. You're going to want to be away from the water if that's coming. They had over 1,800 water rescues in New Bern during Hurricane Florence, and a lot of those happened at night. So it's a very, very scary situation. You want to make sure that you understand where you live or where you're going to be, whether or not you're vulnerable to storm surge, and you want to understand the storm surge forecast, keep an eye on those watches and warnings, and decide whether or not you need to evacuate, because this storm surge comes, and it comes quickly, and it is life-threatening. Down closer to the Crystal Coast, we saw 2 to 4 feet of storm surge around Swansboro, Bogue Sound, Emerald Isle, that area. And then for Hurricane Dorian on the Outer Banks, Ocracoke Island, Hatteras Village, those areas, we saw anywhere from 5 up to about 7 to 8 feet of storm surge inundation. So again, I'm pretty tall. I'm 6 feet, 6'1", and that's well over my head. I certainly wouldn't be able to swim in that with all the wind and the waves and everything like that. So storm surge needs to be taken very seriously. We also have rainfall flooding. This is actually, over the last several years, this has been the #1 killer in hurricanes. 83% of water-related fatalities have been from rainfall and inland flooding, so away from the coast. And most of that, these water-related fatalities, only 4% are storm surge related now. So the last graphic I showed you showed that most of the fatalities were storm surge related, but in the last couple of years, we've gotten so much better at forecasting storm surge. The public officials have gotten better at making evacuations, and you, the public, have gotten better at understanding the threat and getting out of there before the storm comes. So, I mean, this is a great opportunity to pat yourself on the back, because we've really done a good job of cutting way down on the storm surge deaths. But what we see now is this inland flooding and river flooding is what's killing people. And of that river flooding, more than half of those are actually people in their vehicles. So what it is they're trying to drive through flooded roadways. So let's take a look at Hurricane Florence again. So a large portion of southeast North Carolina saw 20 to 30 inches. I think the highest amount we saw was right around 30 inches in our area, and that was near Swansboro. So really a significant amount of rainfall fell. We had flooding on essentially all of the creeks and streams in this part of the state, and then eventually that flowed down to the river. So we saw major flooding in a large part of the state. So if you're out after the hurricane's gone, the sun's back out, the sun's shining, the weather's nice, but you know that you just had a ton of rainfall, and you come up on something that looks like this. So it's a flooded roadway. You say, well, you know, maybe you got a SUV or a taller truck. You say, I really got to get to the other side. Maybe I'll drive through it. Well, that's not a good idea. You have no idea what's under the water. The road could be completely washed out. So please, 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 I really want to stress this is where we've seen the most fatalities in the last several years with Matthew, with Florence, with all these heavy rain producer storms. Please turn around, don't drown. That's where people are dying now. Please do not drive through flooded roadways ever. And like I said, we do have river flooding. So this, well after the storm's gone, the rain stops, the water all works its way down into the rivers, and we'll see these significant impacts. So we are, of course, watching the rivers. We issue river flood warnings to let you know that it's coming. So that's another aspect. And this is, again, after Florence. So this is the Trent River in POLLOCKSVILLE. So you can see this isn't just a little bit of flooding. These rivers have the potential to come way up, and obviously life-threatening storm surge. You don't want to be, if you live in a flood-prone area, you don't want to be at home during the storm or well after the storm, because those rivers are going to come up, and obviously this is a life-threatening situation. All right, now we'll talk about tornadoes. Tornadoes are obviously an aspect of hurricanes. You're already going to be sheltered in place because of the hurricane, the strong winds, but these tornadoes have the potential to produce localized areas of more extensive damage. So the really key with tornadoes in a hurricane is you want to have multiple ways to get a warning. A no weather radio is a great way to get a warning. Your cell phone is a great way. Tornado and flash flood warnings will be pushed to your cell phone as long as the cell towers are still working, which in Florence, we saw several cell towers go out, so that's no guarantee. So that's why you want to have multiple ways to get it. You can watch the local news. A lot of the local news have weather apps, and there's just a lot of weather apps in general. And you can download those apps and actually turn on the warnings to receive those. So you got to have multiple ways to get a warning. When you do get a tornado warning, you need to get to the lowest level of your house to an interior room, because that's going to, if that tornado hits you, it's going to produce much stronger winds. It's going to come very quickly. It's going to have the potential to throw debris. So you want to be sheltered from that outside part of your house. You want to put as many walls between you and the outside of your house as possible to help protect you from flying debris or damage that's going to occur outside of your house. So when you get that tornado warning, you want to act immediately to get to that interior part of your house and stay there until you're sure that you're in the clear. And the last threat that we'll talk about is rip currents. So behind Dorian in 2019, the second most deadly storm of the season. Ask yourself what you think that is. So Dorian was the most deadly for 2019, but what do you think was the second most deadly? I'll give you a little hint. We didn't end up getting enough storms to use the last 3 names on the list. So give you a little hint and narrow it down a little bit, but did you know that the answer was actually Lorenzo? Lorenzo was the second most deadly storm, and Lorenzo stayed way off the coast. The center of the storm didn't pass anywhere near the United States, but it did sink a tugboat out in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. And then locally, our impact was actually rip current fatalities. So the storm generated a lot of swell that came to the eastern United States and produced large surf along the beaches and very strong rip currents. And we ended up having 8 fatalities from rip currents from Hurricane Lorenzo, which again, not a drop of rain from Hurricane Lorenzo fell on the United States, but it resulted in 8 fatalities. So really want to stress, even if the storm's not affecting us directly, that those storms that stay out way out in the ocean, they used to call them fish storms, used to be a nickname for them, but we're really trying to get away from that, because this shows that they impact way more than just fish. So if you're heading to the beach in any time during the summer or in the fall, just make sure that you're aware of what the rip current risk is, or always swim near a lifeguard, pay attention to the beach flags, because even if the weather's great on the coast, there could be a storm out in the middle of the ocean producing strong swells and rip currents. And if you do get caught in a rip current, you're going to want to firstly relax. The rip current does not pull you under, it pulls you out. So first you want to do is relax. Most people who drown in rip currents basically drown because they panic. And then when they panic, they exhaust themselves and they're not able to tread water. You don't even have to swim, just tread water. Eventually the rip current will release you. If you can stay calm, then you want to, if you don't feel like you're such a strong swimmer, definitely float, maybe wave your hand and yell as best you can. Again, you always want to swim near a lifeguard, so you want to try to get that lifeguard's attention, get the attention of someone on the beach. If you do feel like you're a pretty strong swimmer, you can try swimming parallel to the shore. Don't swim directly back to the shore. Swim parallel to the shore to try to get out of that rip current. Once you feel like you're not being pulled out anymore, then you can try to gradually swim back toward the shore or swim back to a sandbar. But the key is, we really want to stress, the number one thing is remain calm. The majority of rip current fatalities are because people panic and exhaust themselves. It's not because they get pulled under. So float, wave, and yell, or if you feel comfortable, swim parallel to shore. So that's really all I have for our hurricane preparedness and our hurricane basics. Just some keys that I really want to be a takeaway. Always get the information from a reputable source ahead of the storms. Like we did with our poll question, we know who those people are. The category of the storm is just one little wind aspect of the storm. The impacts are so much greater. So make sure you're getting good information and understanding all of the impacts, and understand your flood risk. Do you live in a low-lying area? Do you live near a river that could flood? Understand that ahead of the storm so that you can know how to interpret that forecast to keep yourself safe. And have multiple ways to get a warning. If we do issue a tornado or a flash flood warning, you want to make sure you're getting that warning so you can take action immediately. And finally, never drive through flooded roadways. As we talked about recently, this has been the main killer with these hurricanes, is the potential for inland flooding and flooded roadways, and then people try to drive through. So more than half of those inland flooding fatalities are people who are in their car and have essentially a lot of times chosen to drive into the flooded area. So please do not drive into flooded areas. Turn around, don't drown. Just remember that. And now I will launch our final poll question of the morning. So we went over the hurricane impacts and we got which of the following is not a potential hurricane impact. So is it strong winds, flooding, drought, rip currents, or tornadoes? Which of the following is not a potential hurricane impact? And give you about 30 more seconds to take a look and select your answer. All right. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we'll share the results. You guys are so smart. You nailed it. Drought. Drought is not really a hurricane impact. Normally, these hurricanes are tropical. They produce heavy rainfall. Drought is the total opposite of what we would expect from a hurricane. But strong winds, the flooding, the water coming, storm surge coming up, heavy rainfall coming down, really water coming at you from all directions, rip currents, tornadoes, those are all impacts that we would expect with a hurricane. So with that, that's all I have for the presentation. I'll, like I said before, I can switch over and we can take some questions. If you have questions, please enter them in the GoToWebinar control panel where I showed you before. And I'll go ahead and close this poll and put up the last slide, which is my contact information. So yeah, if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to reach out. carl.barnes@noaa.gov is my email address. And just as a reminder, weather.gov/Morehead City, that has your forecast information, but that also has great preparedness information. It has a future schedule of these kind of informational webinars and all that. Right now, with a lot of people kind of stuck at home, we're trying to do a whole bunch of these and cover a whole bunch of different threats. So I really appreciate everyone hopping on, and I will take a look at what kind of questions we might have.